Fresh Economic Thinking podcast. New ideas and analysis with Dr. Cameron Murray and Jonathan Gadir.
G'day Cameron, how are you going?
I'm terrific. It's been a while. How are you, Jonathan?
It has been a while. I'm very good, and you're everywhere because you got a book just out this last few days.
That's right. The Great Housing Hijack, uh, written all last year, is finally out there for the world to enjoy, scrutinize, and talk about, I hope. It came out on the 27th of February. I've had a few events in Sydney, and there are a few book events to come in Brisbane and Melbourne as well. So, yeah, it's very exciting times.
We'll put the details of those events in the show notes for all the people that are listening, soon after this gets posted. It's called The Great Housing Hijack, the hoaxes and myths keeping prices high for renters and buyers in Australia. So Cameron, you start the book with, a story, an alternative story, something a bit science fiction-y. And you ask people to imagine what it would be like in a world where landlords were competing for tenants in the rental market, and they were bidding and outbidding each other just to have tenants live in their property. What was the purpose of that story?
Like all things, probably that came to me while I was walking the dog or in the shower, but I just must have been thinking. One of the things I often do is flip things in reverse and see if they make sense and ask, why aren't they the opposite of what they are? And so that story is just to show a few things. Firstly, that what it would actually look like for the market to work. Our conversation about housing is we've got to get the market to work. Okay, so in this dream story, the market is working and landlords are bidding down the price to compete for tenants. And it's to really get you thinking, oh, that's weird. It's never like that. Why is that? So it's really to get you thinking, because the rest of the sort of introduction of the book is about, well, what do property markets actually do and why? Why aren't they the opposite of what they are? And is that information important if we want to enact policies to get a different outcome? And I think it is. So I just think it's I think at the end of the day, I decided to keep it there just to get the reader thinking when they start this book, because I think there are a lot of challenging ideas and you really, need to switch on.
The thing I got from that story was there's no such thing as a property market which is not a zero-sum game. Like, if someone is losing, then someone is winning. If someone's getting a high price and someone else is getting a low income.
That's
A
right.
high
Well,
income. Sorry, yeah.
yeah, I know what you're trying to say, because I call that in the book the symmetry of property markets. And economists might be listening now and saying, that's, outdated thinking. Not everything's zero sum. But of course, that's true. But once all the positive sum transactions have been made, right, you're at what we call an equilibrium in economics. And then from that point, any policy that intervenes does create a winner for every loser, dollar for dollar. And that, I think, is that the heart of why I say the debate on housing is hijacked, because it's kind of a taboo to say we want the price of everyone's house to fall so that 100,000 people can buy off you for a cheaper price next year. Like, no one wants that to happen. So we use the term affordable. Oh, what does that mean? Oh, it means prices can keep going up, but for somehow people can just buy them. We'll sort of orchestrate with some financial magic something. And so, yeah, we avoid confronting that fact, and that's sort of sets you up for all the economics that comes and all the political economy and the analysis of all the vested interests. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you go through in the book some quite interesting historical examples of how it's not new at all in Australia and elsewhere for there to be a so-called housing crisis or affordability crisis. It seems to be quite standard that it's
Yeah.
really difficult for many people to afford housing. You've got also, lovely quotes from the 19th century and from earlier in the 20th century about that in various Australian cities. What does that tell you? Does that tell you that where the capitalist system is just bad at providing basics as human needs for basic human needs? Like what's the
Uh, I don't think I get that deep and philosophical about capitalism and all that because, there's plenty of, yeah, I find once you start labeling things capitalist or neoliberal or this and that, people just don't have any solid meanings for these words. So it's not worth a conversation. We should talk about housing and how it's built, how it's allocated, at a concrete level. The point, yeah, you're right. And one of the big points and the reason for going through that history is because I think, how would I put it? The debate today, the terms of the debate on housing policy today are that the housing market will provide everyone a cheap home wherever they want it. The problem is that we're not getting the market to work properly. And if we get out of the way, taxes, regulations, whatever, help the market work with shared equity or government loan guarantees, then we'll get towards this utopia. And once you start looking through history and looking around the world, you just cannot find this free market in housing utopia where everyone can buy a house. And history is great, right? Because prior to the Second World War, Australian governments were tiny, 5% of the economy, basically no income taxes, basically no regulations on anything. We lived the utopia, right? In Australia. And what do we have? Super low home ownership, right? Terrible slums. That was the big problem of the day. And, why? Like how? Right? Surely with the lack of taxes, landlords should have been selling cheap land to everybody and people should have been building cheap houses, but that wasn't the case. And my favorite quote, I say it every time I talk about the book, is that when this famous celebrity went to Sydney, the first thing they wrote in their diary was the number of homes recently built is truly astounding. Nevertheless, everyone complains about the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house. And of course, that wasn't the celebrity Taylor Swift in 2024. That was the celebrity Charles Darwin, the biologist in 1836, who just, observed with a population of 20,000 people in the whole of New South Wales that the human animals, their behavior was complained about housing. Before he looked at the kangaroos, the marsupials, you name it. Then you've got to ask yourself some questions, I think, right? That history forces you to be a little bit more honest with yourself when talking about, oh, so if I get rid of stamp duty, maybe prices will collapse. Well, okay, so why were they expensive, when Charles Darwin visited? Why are they expensive in New Zealand that doesn't have stamp duty? Like, let's look around and observe first before we reverse into our political tribe's preferred housing policy, which is very common.
Okay. So before I sort of get into some of the more like contemporary news events that are happening around housing and get your take on them from the perspective of this book, if I was to identify like an enemy or a sort of an opponent in your book of your position, it's what you're calling a YIMBY. Could you tell me what a YIMBY is?
Yeah, Yimbys get their own chapter, but that's a small part of the whole story. A Yimby is a person who is part of who has a view that yes, in my backyard, that's Yimby,
Mhm.
is the appropriate position to take politically to get cheap housing. And of course, that is in contrast to a NIMBY, and not in my backyard. And sort of caricature of the NIMBY is a retired white baby boomer with a big house in a premium inner city suburb of Australia's capital cities who doesn't like apartments being built next door and other disruptive things in their neighborhood. And the YIMBY ethos is essentially that this is that barrier. Like as I said, the one of the framing one of the frames of our debate is that the market will work if we find the exact thing that's wrong with it and fix that. And the YIMBYs go, well, yeah, maybe it's taxes, maybe it's this, but you know what? The problem is the regulations that NIMBYs create to prohibit certain types of apartments or high rises in their neighborhood. And I've found that perfect thing. And if we fix that regulation, the housing market will be perfect as it is in my mind, but of course, as I show in the book, was never and can't find it anywhere in history or globally. And so the YIMBYs are funny because they're such a big online presence these days, and it's such a feature of the 2020s boom, or what I might call it. It was nascent in the 2010s boom in New South Wales. In a lot of the capital cities, there was a big price boom, lots of apartments built, and then prices fell for 5 years before COVID. And the YIMBYs are this new thing. But I remember back in the 2000s boom, in 2003, there was the first homeowners, Prime Minister's task force into first home ownership and a bunch of other reports. And they all sort of said, yeah, regulation's bad, regulation's bad. But then in the next property cycle, it sort of became a kind of cultural movement, like a climate change type movement, but a change the planning system movement. And I think it's missing the mark, basically, in terms of what is causing the current rents and prices.
Mm.
So
So
yeah,
what's causing the current rents and prices?
what's causing it? Great.
Yes.
Well, I have 5 chapters in the book about the 5 property market equilibria. So equilibrium is an idea in economics that essentially says if people are allowed to trade things with each other, they will come to a point where there's almost no benefit from trading, and that's an equilibrium. And the best way I explain this, I mean, I use it in the book, but I use it when I teach economics, is if you're at a supermarket checkout, there's 2 checkouts and there's a queue. One of the queues has 5 people and one has 10 people. Now, because you're allowed to exchange one queue for another, that's not an equilibrium, right? Because there's profitable opportunities to switch. But when there's 7 in one and 8 in another, when those people have switched, that's an equilibrium. And that 8th person might switch back if they guess the other one's going. So you do get those trades back and forth, and those trades of people switching from one queue to the other keep the aggregate measure of the queue length at the equilibrium point. And so there are 5 dimensions where this logic applies in housing. And if you understand that, you can pretty much predict reasonably well why rents are what they are, why they're rising fast, why houses are what they are, why, for example, in May 2020, during COVID, when everyone was panicked about prices falling 30%, I said in a podcast at the time, prices are more likely to rise 20% than fall 20%. It would be so abnormal for them to fall right now. And people said, where'd you get your degrees in economics? Back of a cornflakes packet. And of course, prices went up 30 or 40% immediately after. And so I might take a moment and actually run through these because they link to a lot of what else is in the book. Are you up for that?
Yeah, just don't give away everything so people still have a reason to buy it. Yeah.
I'm sure the listeners to this podcast will be loyal and they'll buy it, and at least one for their friends as
Okay.
well.
All right.
But maybe we'll start with a couple of the more important ones for the policy debate, and that's the asset price equilibrium. And we have this idea in mind that we can somehow get the asset price of homes to be cheaper and everything else in the economy stays as it is, right? But that doesn't make sense, right? Because $1 in a house can be switched into a different queue in $1 for shares or $1 for bonds or $1 for any other asset in the economy. And so if the queue for housing gets shorter because the price falls, people will switch back into housing until the price goes up. And that equilibrium is the yield on, like, the rate of return on a dollar invested in that asset. And so house prices can't just go up because of supply and demand, or just go down because of supply and demand. Supply and demand just means the adjustment process of people trading from one queue to the other. That's all it means. It doesn't tell you why the queue's that long, or anything like that. And so, yeah, I think in the debate, if you don't understand this, you can be tricked into thinking that, oh, house prices can all fall 50%, but all the other asset prices in the economy, they can stay where they are, right? And
Right.
we can have a condition where you put a dollar in housing and get a 10% yield, but you put a dollar in the bank and get 3%. How can that be sustained? It can't be. And so that's the first of five of these property market equilibria that just show you that a lot of what we talk about in the housing debate is just economically impossible. Right. And that's just part of, and no one says this. And so we keep going around and around. Oh, my friend Peter Tulip, former RBA, now CIS, at the think tank, an economist, he will say, yeah, 40% of the value of Sydney property is due to regulations. I'm like, but if property in Sydney fell 40%, you'd be getting like an 8% yield. You could just borrow money and make free money buying houses. Prices would have to go back up. Like, that's not an equilibrium. But yeah, anyway, so that's why I really felt the urge to just put this down all together in a coherent way in the book. Does that
Yeah.
make sense to you?
Yes, it does. Um,
Oh, man.
so the solution, and probably people have heard you say this before, at least the solution for the group of people in the world or in Australia for whom the market is not working because everything's just beyond their reach, the solution is to do what previous governments have done proudly and boasted of
Mm,
doing, which is to just build people houses that they can afford. Like the government does it, yeah? Non-market or sort of apart from the private market.
correct.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, globally, yeah. Before we get into those specific examples, I think this is where we go wrong with, oh, we got to let the market work.
Mm.
If you zoom back in time to the 60s and 70s, you can be tricked with some of the data to thinking, see, when the market worked then, things were cheap. But those decades were very abnormal. Those post-war decades in Australia and globally, super abnormal in housing. There are studies that look at, housing prices and rents over 300 years in a bunch of European cities. And, everyone's in poverty, rents are ridiculously high. And then post-war, there's this 3 decades of huge public intervention and cheap housing for residents, like much cheaper than wages. And then you see this from the 1970s today, a sort of return on that curve to the normal market outcome. So I think we get bamboozled. And of course, yeah, in that post-war period, in Australia, the UK, I mean, you name a place, it sort of became a public obligation to make sure everyone was housed. You could not have soldiers return from war for your country and have them homeless on the street. It just wasn't politically viable. And so we we built like so many um public homes, and we subsidized so many people into home ownership uh for 3 decades. And we got home ownership up from about 43% before the Second World War, up to nearly 72% in the early 1970s. So a third of people went from renting in the private market into home ownership in those decades. And then since then, it's fallen slightly over the last 50 years to 66.6 or 66.4%, if we trust the 2021 census.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's kind of the story
Yeah.
on public housing and home ownership. Yeah.
Why do you think it's such a taboo to say, look, the government should just build houses? Like, is it just the standard like taboo that we've had on everything to do with public sector since, I guess, the 1980s sort of rise of what
I,
my ex-lecturer calls economic rationalism?
yeah, I the short answer is it's all in our minds, right?
Mm.
It really is. We don't mind governments building roads, footpaths, pipes, everything, all the way up to the front fence. But, once you cross that fence, magically everyone's incompetent and it's such a waste of money. And we couldn't definitely subsidize anyone on that side of the fence. So I do find it really puzzling. But we can see that live. So just last week, as you're listening, and a few days ago as we're recording, Max Chandler Mather, the Greens federal MP, who happens to be my local member, he announced that the Greens' major housing plank is to have a large-scale public housing developer who sells houses cheap to universally and rents them cheap to other local residents. And he announced this at the press club in a speech alongside the CEO of the Property Council of Australia. And they all thought he was insane. Like, oh, he's just announced that aliens have landed. The looks on their face, I tell you.
Yeah.
And all he's saying is, you want more houses and you want people in them cheaply. Why don't we just do it direct?
Yeah.
And everyone flipped out. And I think in the book I explained why there's certain interest groups will say certain things, but I think it is a great move, and there'll be actually an article on Fresh Economic Thinking in the coming weeks with a few more examples of effective public housing that fly under the radar, which might change some views.
Um, this is okay, a small diversion. Some people say, and it sort of
Great.
strikes a chord with me that like we just for some reason we can't seem to do public works anymore. Like everything blows out in cost, everything takes forever. There's all these like dodgy subcontractors and mistakes and bungles and fiascos. Look at the North Sydney swimming pool, the public pool just under the Harbour Bridge, which I used to go to, and I haven't been able to go for 3 years because that
Oh,
just
wow.
completely stuffed up the renovation. Like, is there something to the fact that like what big public works that we used to be able to do, somehow we can't really do that anymore for whatever reason? Something in our
I think
society has changed. Some economic factors involved have changed, labor availability, or I don't know. You tell me.
uh yeah, that's a common view, and I guess I'm as wary as anyone, right, of big projects with big budgets just getting taken advantage of. Like, uh, yeah, you can't count me in on that concern.
Hmm.
However, I think there's two issues. One, we have a bit of rose-colored glasses about the history of these things. If you read archived, parliamentary reviews and government reports on, for example, the soldier housing after the First World War, you'll find, you know, the governor of Victoria overpaid for land from his cousins to put soldier housing, and then, employed his old school friend, and, it was basically corrupt. But things got done, slightly overpaid. I think we're actually much more sophisticated these days. The other big point is that plenty of private projects go broke and cost blowout and are terrible, right? We have how many buildings in Sydney that are falling down and can't be occupied?
Hmm.
So I think we have a bit of an unrealistic expectation on that one. And lastly, a lot of politically uncontroversial projects just slide through as a matter of routine, right? The states build schools and build things pretty much routinely. The more routine it becomes, the better everyone involved in those processes gets at it. And I think it would be the same with housing. It's not like a public sector developer would employ plumbers. They would tender out to projects just like they do for everything. And they would get people saying, oh, we can build you 100 on this site here at this standard for this price. And you would select from them. Or in certain areas, you go and acquire the land and you just pay someone else to manage it. Just like, for example, my favorite example is the private build to rent project on the Gold Coast. Well, it's owned by the Abu Dhabi Investment Council, right? An
Mhm.
Australian build to rent project. A foreign government owns it. Well, hang on a minute. Can't governments not do anything? Well, they just own it, right? They just pay professionals to do it for them,
Yeah.
right? And they incentivize them and they hold them accountable. And we could do it too. I fear it will become politically like a hot potato. Oh, this and that, you can't build in this suburb, you can't do this, which is fine. But like everything, once you've done it a few times, people have accepted it, they like
Mm,
it, and they want more of it, and everyone gets good at it.
yeah. And your
So
favorite
yeah, I'm
example is
definitely worried.
Singapore. Singapore is your favorite
Yeah,
example, of course, of government
yeah, they pump out
provided housing.
20,000 new apartments a year. They've got their own, it's called volumetric prefab construction process that they've evolved over decades to, yeah, just get it built real quick with a lot of prefab and less on site. That's what happens. And I get it. Governments aren't innovative, but they're pretty good at just doing the same boring stuff over and over. And that's
Yeah.
what this could be over time.
Final question then, Cameron, or questions in the news at the moment. We've got immigration being discussed quite a bit. We've also got
Hmm.
population. What's the effect on those things on your your take on the housing market?
Yeah, I mean, that's a super common issue online these days, Jonathan. Every time I write about housing, every comment is, you're not talking about immigration. Okay. I've talked about this for a decade, and I've explained how the higher this rate is, the more difficult it is to accommodate everyone, both the public works, the hospitals, schools, roads, etc., duplicating all the services, including housing. But unfortunately, like the reality is more subtle, and that is just like in 1924, the few million Australians then were right not to be concerned that there'd be 26 million of us in 100 years, right? So it's not this overall trend, it's just this adjustment process. If you're growing at 2 or 3% per year, that means you have to duplicate everything in every city, expand that stock of capital, roads built like buildings, houses by 2 or 3%. But if you only grow at half or 1%, no, you only have to um, spend a quarter of the amount on duplicating homes and duplicating roads, right? So it's a massive uh, ability to redirect economic resources into making things better for people. And in terms of rents, the immigration, the way I summarize it is, yeah, there are large effects on rents, but they're temporary because over time, everybody moves around into different homes. People adjust how many people are in each home. And after 3 years, you're essentially back to the normal rental equilibrium. So the rental equilibrium is the second big idea in housing. So yeah, it's a bit more subtle. It's a temporary effect, um, and we're experiencing it now. There are long run costs in terms of duplicating things, but I think if we look back in 5 years, we'll go, oh, yeah, it's fine. We're in a no different place to what we otherwise would have been.
All right, Cameron, then if people want to see you in person, any events you can tell us about?
Yeah, there are a few coming up. Brisbane, 13th of March, 6 p.m. at Avid Reader at West End. Melbourne on the 20th of March, 3:30 p.m. at RMIT. And Canberra on the 21st of March, 6:30 p.m., hosted by the Australia Institute. Go to Fresh Economic Thinking and you'll see all the links in the pinned article.
Oh, brilliant.
That's
And
where
it's
you'll
so
see me.
good. It's so good to see like a, sort of very established kind of center left think tank hosting you. It's really good.
Mate, I think people from across the spectrum I'm talking to. I'll be on the Spectators Australiana podcast as well.
Mm.
Um, yeah, this topic is of interest to everyone, and I think telling it straight in the book with straight economics is useful across the board.
Very good. All right. Look forward to chatting again soon.
All right, thanks, Jonathan.